Welcome everyone. For the first time on this channel, I want to provide some perspective on a critical social issue that I have been seeing a lot in the news. And that social issue is about revising or changing the age requirement for sexual relations. Before I get to my personal perspectives on this issue, I did want to give some background and talk about what brought this into the news recently, as well as talk about the arguments both for and against. So what brought this into the news recently was the United Nations International Committee of Jurists released a new set of proposals for legal principles. And it's called the 8 March Principles, and this was released on International Women's Day. And it was a proposal for human rights-based approaches to laws criminalizing behavior related to sex, drug use, sexual and reproductive health, homelessness, and poverty. The reason for the set of approvals was best stated by the Law and Policy Director at ICJ. And he stated that criminal law is among the harshest of tools at the disposal of the state to exert control over individuals. As such, it ought to be a measure of last resort. However, globally, there has been a growing trend towards over-criminalization in this area. And the United Nations states that in 2023, 20 countries criminalize or otherwise prosecute transgender people. 67 countries still criminalize same-sex sexual activity, and 115 report criminalizing drug use. More than 130 countries criminalize HIV exposure. Over 150 countries criminalize some aspect of sex work. Now, I think all of us would agree that the criminalization of the list that I just described is obviously something of concern and should be addressed globally. However, the controversy started when you look further into these 8 March principles, and there was a principle 16 that addressed consensual sexual conduct. The controversial part starts here, and this is what I quote from that principle. With respect to the enforcement of criminal law, any prescribed minimum age of consent to sex must be applied in a non-discriminatory manner. Enforcement may not be linked to the sex/gender of participants or age of consent to marriage. Moreover, sexual conduct involving persons below the domestically prescribed minimum age of consent to sex may be consensual in fact, if not in law. In this context, the enforcement of criminal law should reflect the rights and capacity of persons under 18 years of age to make decisions about engaging in consensual sexual conduct and their right to be heard in matters concerning them. Pursuant to their evolving capacities and progressive autonomy, persons under 18 years of age should participate in decisions affecting them with due regard to their age, maturity, and best interests, and with specific attention to non-discrimination guarantees. So at first glance of reading this principle language, I was a bit concerned. So I wanted to delve deeper into the background with regard to this statement. And so I did do some research on the people who are for some possible adjustment of the age requirement and those who are opposed to making any changes to that 18 years of age requirement. So some of the arguments for the removing or revising of the minimum age requirements for sexual relations is around cultural variation. So Critics of the age of consent laws argue that these regulations are culturally biased and may not align with the values or traditions of certain communities and societies. They also purport that this goes against individual autonomy, and some proponents of removing the age restrictions believe that young people should have the right to make decisions about their own bodies and relationships without interference of the state. The other argument focuses on the inconsistency of age across consent laws. It talks about in certain countries, different states and provinces, there may be varying in ages in the requirement, and some claims that these consent laws are often arbitrary and they do not necessarily reflect the emotional or psychological maturity of the individuals involved. So the arguments for those who are against making any changes to age requirements, the first thing is to understand why it was put into place. So the age of consent laws are established to protect minors from exploitation and abuse. And then by setting a legal age for sexual relations, we can prevent the manipulation and coercion of young people that may not be able to make informed decisions about their own bodies and relationships. So those that are against this are worried that by doing away with the age of consent laws, that there would be an increased risk of exploitation, and that with no legal age barrier, vulnerable minors may be manipulated or coerced to engaging in sexual activities before they are emotionally or psychologically prepared. There's also big concerns that by removing that age, that this would provide a normalization of pedophilia, and that eliminating age of consent laws would inadvertently contribute to the normalization of pedophilia, which would then be no longer considered a criminal act. And the final argument against, from a legal perspective, is that the removal of these laws would create confusion and inconsistency and make it more difficult to prosecute. But aside from the legal aspects, there are a lot of concerns from a moral and ethical perspective. And of course, the first is consent and autonomy, that young people who may not have the emotional maturity to truly understand the implications of engaging in sexual activities. This calls into question whether or not we can truly give informed consent at a younger age. And the other issue that people are worried about is the psychological harms, and that minors who engage in sexual relations without fully understanding the consequences suffer from long-term psychological harm, such as anxiety, depression, and PTSD. The other concern is societal values, that by removing age of consent laws, this may signal to society that the protection of minors is not a priority. This would potentially erode trust in the legal system and create a more permissive environment for exploitation. So why am I doing a video about this, and why is this so important to me? Well, 8 years ago, I was in a struggling marriage, and it was only when our marriage was at the point of collapse that my husband was able to reveal for the first time to anyone in his entire life a terrible history of childhood abuse at the hands of the Catholic Church. I was able to see firsthand the damage that sexual abuse of minors can result in. And it doesn't just affect the individual victim and survivor, but it impacts the entire community, their entire family and support system throughout their entire lives. And this is not something that will ever go away. This trauma will be something that my husband deals with for the rest of his life. And not only my husband, but also me, his other family members, and our children will be impacted by the trauma that was imposed on my husband at a very early age. I was recently reading an article of a man who was also abused by the Catholic Church, who was able to be in a lawsuit. And he basically took the words out of my mouth from what I've experienced with my husband. And that is that when he talks about the impact of being sexually abused when he was a child, he says, and I quote, "It has destroyed my life. I haven't been existing properly for 50 whatever years. You do things on autopilot. You take risks. You do crazy stuff. You try to kill yourself," he said. And I think that this really sums up what I've experienced, what my husband has expressed. So after reading the different arguments for and against, and then also my own personal experience with childhood sexual abuse trauma, how do I feel about what I read in the United Nations March Principles? I think that I understand some of the arguments that it's hard to put a hard and fast age on consent. And I do think that the United Nations document and the people who were involved in the creation of that principle were trying to take that into account. That it's very difficult to have an age requirement, an age specific limit on when that consent and maturity level for an individual occurs. So I understand those concerns, and I also understand the cultural differences that are out there and the fact that our laws are not consistent. However, I am definitely concerned about the language that was included in this principle. The fact that they did not state specifically in the principle that they were referring to adolescents, which is what I'm assuming based off of what I read from the UN is what they were referring to. This is obviously very concerning. Children should not be expected to be able to give consent to what happens to their physical bodies. I mean, they can barely make decisions about what to eat or how much TV to watch, much less the consent to a sexual act. The other concern I have is just from a statistical basis. The statistics, 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys will be sexually abused before they turn 18. We also know that nearly 70% of all reported sexual assaults occur to children aged 17 and under. So these statistics, I think, will lead us to the fact that we need to have age laws that protect this age group. I can also say that perpetrators are everywhere. They are very smart. They are very good at the grooming process. Children should not be put into the place of determining whether or not consent is theirs when this sort of manipulation, this sort of coercion is going on in the vast majority of the cases. Instead of spending our time arguing over a particular age limit, I think we need to be spending a lot more time on how we can prevent this, how we can protect our children, and we also need to figure out how we can have better conversations and how we can have better support if something does happen. I believe that these age of consent laws were put in place for the right reason, and that was to protect our children and to protect minors. I think that the literature shows us that the perpetrators and the children that are involved in these cases creates a very complex environment where consent cannot be assumed and consent should not be expected and should not even be part of the discussion. I would really like to know what other people are thinking about what they're seeing in the news about this. So if you found this helpful to hear some of the background and you have something to say about it, I would encourage you to leave a comment, reach out to me directly. And I am on a mission to stop the silence of both trauma survivors and their spouses who are struggling during the trauma healing process. I have spent the last 8 years researching and trial and error of tools and tactics to help get through that healing process. And I want to share those with others. I want to share our story because I'm hoping that we can be of some hope for couples who are struggling in trauma recovery. So if you found this helpful, please check out my website for additional resources for spouses who are supporting.